It was the largest country on Earth, spanning 11 time zones, commanding the world's second-largest nuclear arsenal, and ruling nearly 300 million people. Then, in the space of just 72 hours, it vanished from the map. The Soviet Union was not destroyed by a foreign invasion. It collapsed under the weight of its own exhaustion, fear, and broken promises. What you're about to witness is not just political history. It's the story of how empires die from the inside out. For generations, the only way to see this story was through blurry news footage and faded black and white photographs locked away in government archives. Images that were never meant to be seen, moments that were never meant to be remembered. But now, using advanced AI to bring motion and life back into those forgotten photographs and long, silent Cold War recordings, we won't just tell this story. You'll watch it unravel in real time, almost as if you were standing right there in the crowd. This is a story that begins in the wreckage of a world war, in a country so broken and so desperate that millions of people were willing to burn everything down just for the chance to start over. It moves through decades of iron rule, secret police, space rockets, and nuclear standoffs. It passes through bread lines, lies, and a nuclear disaster the government tried to hide from its own people. And it ends on a quiet Christmas evening in Moscow, when one man sat down at a desk, picked up a pen, and signed away the largest country in human history. From Lenin's revolution to Mikhail Gorbachev's final signature on December 25, 1991, this is the entire collapse of the Soviet Union. Let's begin at the beginning. It didn't begin with a grand ceremony. It didn't begin with crowds cheering in the streets or flags waving over a glittering capital city. It began in December 1922 in a cold meeting room in Moscow with 4 exhausted republics and a piece of paper. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Transcaucasia, a region covering what is now Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, sat down together and signed a single treaty. In doing so, they created something the world had never quite seen before. Not a country in the way most people understood the word. Not a kingdom or an empire built around one people and one culture. Something stranger than that. A union, a collection of very different nations, languages and ways of life, all pressed together under one flag, one government, and one ruling party. Nobody in that room was celebrating. They were survivors. Just a few years earlier, Russia had been torn apart by revolution and then by a brutal civil war that left somewhere between 7 and 12 million people dead, not just from fighting, but from famine and disease that followed the fighting everywhere it went. The country that emerged from that horror was exhausted, hungry, and held together more by fear and necessity than by any shared dream. The men who built the Soviet Union were called the Bolsheviks. They had taken power in 1917 by promising the Russian people 3 things: land, peace, and bread. What they actually built was something different. A system where the Communist Party made every important decision. Where the government owned the factories, the farms, and the newspapers. Where saying the wrong thing in public could get you arrested. It wasn't built on freedom, it was built on control. The man who led this new state was Vladimir Lenin. He understood better than anyone that the Soviet Union was a fragile thing. He knew that holding so many different peoples together under one system would require constant pressure from above. But by the time the ink dried on that founding treaty, Lenin was already sick. Within 2 years, he would be dead. And waiting quietly in the background, watching, calculating, and collecting allies one by one, was a man named Joseph Stalin. Lenin had actually written a private note near the end of his life warning the party about Stalin. He called him too rude, too dangerous, too hungry for power. He suggested the party remove him from his position. The party ignored the warning. Stalin would go on to rule the Soviet Union for nearly 3 decades. Under his leadership, the union that had been built on the promise of a better life for working people would become something far darker, a state where millions of its own citizens would be imprisoned, exiled, or killed simply for being seen as a threat. But the Soviet Union isn't just a state, it's a bet that you can hold human nature itself in a clenched fist forever. That bet is about to be tested. Lenin died in January 1924. He was 53 years old. And before his body was even cold, the fight to replace him had already begun. Joseph Stalin was not the most obvious choice. He was not the most popular man in the party. He was not the most gifted speaker or the most brilliant thinker. But he was the most patient, the most calculating, and the most willing to do whatever it took to win. One by one, he outmaneuvered his rivals, exiling some, discrediting others, waiting until the moment was right to remove each one. By the late 1920s, Stalin had what he wanted. He was in control of the largest country on Earth. What came next is almost impossible to describe in a way that does justice to its scale. Stalin was afraid, not of foreign enemies, not yet, but of the people around him, of rivals inside the party, of generals who might one day decide they had more power than he did, of ordinary citizens who might be secretly loyal to the old ways, the old religion, the old Russia that existed before the revolution. And when Stalin was afraid of something, he destroyed it. Between 1936 and 1938, during the years that historians call the Great Purge, Stalin's secret police, known as the NKVD, arrested, tortured, and executed approximately 750,000 Soviet citizens. These were not criminals. They were Communist Party officials, military officers, factory managers, writers, engineers, and teachers. People who had dedicated their lives to building the Soviet state. People who were guilty of nothing except being noticed. The numbers inside the military alone are staggering. In just 2 years, the Red Army lost 3 of its 5 top marshals, 13 of its 15 army commanders, and 50 of its 57 corps commanders. Stalin had essentially beheaded his own armed forces. The consequences of this became horribly clear on June 22, 1941, when Nazi Germany launched the largest military invasion in human history, pouring over 3 million soldiers across the Soviet border in a single morning. The Red Army, stripped of so many of its most experienced leaders, was caught almost completely off guard. In the first weeks of the invasion, entire Soviet armies were surrounded and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured. The German advance moved so fast that many Soviet commanders didn't believe the reports coming in. What followed was the most devastating chapter in Soviet history. Over the next 4 years, more than 27 million Soviet citizens would die. Soldiers on the front lines, civilians caught in the crossfire, and millions more who starved in besieged cities like Leningrad, where the German blockade lasted 872 days and killed over 1 million people. The Soviet Union survived. But survival came at a price that no government should ever ask its people to pay. And the system learned something Stalin never intended to teach, that fear is not the same as loyalty, that a people can be forced to fight and forced to work and forced to stay silent, but they cannot be forced to believe. The Soviet Union emerges from World War II as a superpower, but the system that built that power has planted something inside itself, a rot it cannot name and will never be able to cut out. For a moment, and it was a real moment, not just propaganda, the Soviet Union looked like it was winning. Stalin died in March 1953, and the terror that had defined his rule began to slowly lift. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, stood up in front of the Communist Party in 1956 and did something no Soviet leader had ever done before. He told them the truth about Stalin. He called the purges a crime. He called the cult of personality a disaster. For millions of Soviet citizens who had lived through those years in silence and fear, it felt like a window being opened in a room that had been sealed shut for decades. And then, just 1 year later, the Soviet Union did something that made the entire world stop and look up. On October 4, 1957, a metal sphere roughly the size of a beach ball was launched from a remote site in Kazakhstan and broke through the atmosphere into orbit. It was called Sputnik. It weighed just 83 kilograms. It carried no weapons and no cameras. All it did was travel around the Earth once every 96 minutes and broadcast a simple radio beep back down to the surface. But that beep was heard in every capital city in the Western world, and what it said, without a single word, was that the Soviet Union had just beaten America into space. The panic in Washington was immediate and genuine. If Soviet rockets could put a satellite into orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead anywhere on Earth. 4 years later, the Soviets went further. On April 12, 1961, a 27-year-old Air Force pilot named Yuri Gagarin climbed into a small capsule called Vostok 1, was launched from the same Kazakhstan site, and became the first human being in history to leave the planet. He orbited the Earth in 108 minutes. When he landed, not in a specially prepared facility, but in an ordinary field in Saratov Oblast, he climbed out of his capsule and walked toward a passing farmer and her granddaughter, who stared at him in complete confusion. He smiled and said, "Don't be afraid, I'm Soviet." At its peak, the Soviet Union was not just a country. It was a force that shaped the entire planet. Its military contained 5 million active soldiers. Its nuclear arsenal held over 40,000 warheads, enough to destroy every major city on Earth several times over. Its influence stretched from Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, all the way to Vietnam, to North Korea, to Angola, to Afghanistan. In 1961, Soviet-backed East Germany built the Berlin Wall in just 72 hours, cutting a city in half overnight, and the Western powers accepted it. The Soviet Empire had never looked so large. It had never looked so permanent. But permanence is an illusion, and the Soviet system has a problem it cannot solve with rockets or warheads. It is running out of truth. The cracks didn't appear all at once. They appeared slowly, in small places, in ways that were easy to explain away one at a time. But they kept appearing, and by the time anyone in power was willing to admit how deep they ran, the whole structure was already shifting underneath their feet. The Soviet economy had looked strong in the 1960s. GDP was growing at around 5% a year. New apartment blocks were going up across the country. Factories were producing. The system seemed to be working. But through the 1970s, that growth began to slow. Then it slowed some more. By the early 1980s, it had nearly stopped altogether, dropping to less than 1% a year. The official government newspapers kept printing positive numbers. The official government speakers kept giving optimistic speeches. But in the shops, the shelves were getting emptier. Bread queues were getting longer. And ordinary Soviet citizens, who had spent their entire lives being told the system was working, were starting to understand with their own eyes that it wasn't. The black market, illegal trading outside the official government system, became the way millions of people actually survived. You needed connections. You needed something to trade. You needed to know who to talk to and what not to say out loud. The gap between what the government said was happening and what was actually happening grew wider every year. Then came Afghanistan. In December 1979, the Soviet military sent 100,000 troops into Afghanistan to prop up a communist government that was losing control of its own country. The plan was to stabilize the situation quickly and leave. Instead, Soviet soldiers found themselves fighting a grinding, brutal war against Mujahideen fighters, rural guerrillas who knew the mountain terrain and were being supplied with weapons by the United States CIA. The war lasted 10 years. It cost the lives of 15,000 Soviet soldiers and left an estimated 1 million Afghans dead. The coffins came home in sealed zinc boxes. Families were told not to ask questions about how their sons had died. They were told, in some cases, not to hold public funerals. The state was lying. And this time, everyone knew it. Then on April 26, 1986, at 1:23 in the morning, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine exploded. The explosion sent a cloud of radioactive material into the atmosphere that would eventually drift across much of Europe. And the Soviet government's first instinct, its immediate, automatic instinct, was to cover it up. It took 36 hours to begin evacuating the 49,000 people living in the nearby city of Pripyat, just 1 mile from the burning reactor. An estimated 700,000 workers would eventually be brought in to deal with the disaster, most of them never fully told what they were being exposed to. The system that had once launched a man into space could not tell its own people the truth about a fire. By 1985, the Soviet Union is exhausted, economically hollowed out, and searching for someone who can tell it the truth. That person has just been elected General Secretary. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev, and he is about to open a door the Soviet state will never be able to close. March 1985. By Soviet standards, that was young. The 3 men who had led the country before him had all died in office within 3 years of each other, each one older and sicker than the last. The Soviet Union had started to feel like a country being run by a hospital ward. Gorbachev was different. He was energetic, sharp, and willing to say out loud what most people in the party had only been willing to whisper in private, that something was seriously wrong, and that if nobody fixed it soon, the whole system was going to fall apart. But here is the important thing to understand about Gorbachev. He was not trying to end the Soviet Union. He was trying to save it. He believed in the system. He just believed it had become corrupt, dishonest, and inefficient, and that the only way to rescue it was to clean it up. He was a man trying to repair a house without understanding that the foundations had already crumbled. He introduced 2 ideas that would change everything. The first was called Glasnost, which means openness. For the first time in 70 years, Soviet newspapers and television stations were allowed to report on things the government had previously forbidden anyone to discuss. The real casualty figures from Afghanistan, the true scale of the Chernobyl disaster, the history of Stalin's purges and the Gulag prison camps where millions of Soviet citizens had been worked to death. Stories that had been passed around in secret for decades were suddenly appearing in print, on the evening news, in public conversation. Citizens who had spent their entire lives carefully watching what they said began to talk openly in ways they never had before. Satellite dishes appeared on apartment buildings. Western radio stations that had previously been jammed started coming through clearly. The second idea was called Perestroika, which means restructuring. Gorbachev wanted to reform the Soviet economy, to make it more efficient, less corrupt, more responsive to what people actually needed. But he tried to do this without dismantling the central command system that the entire economy ran on. The result was chaos. Factories didn't know whether to follow the old government rules or the new market signals. Managers who had spent their careers waiting to be told what to do were suddenly being told to use their own judgment. Prices rose. Shelves that had been half empty got emptier. The shortages that Perestroika was supposed to fix got worse. The reforms meant to save the Union were quietly pulling the floor out from under it. And Glasnost, the openness, the truth-telling, the lifting of 70 years of enforced silence, was doing something nobody had fully anticipated. It was making people angry, not just about the present, about everything, about Afghanistan, about Chernobyl, about Stalin, about all the decades of lies. But the relationship between Glasnost and control is deteriorating faster than anyone predicted. You cannot tell people the truth about the past without making them question everything about the present, and that question, once asked, cannot be unasked.
Die Mauer muss weg!
The end doesn't come from outside. It comes from within, from every direction at once, faster than anyone in power can respond to. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, not because Soviet tanks push it over, but because nobody stops the crowds that do. For 28 years, that wall had stood as the most visible symbol of Soviet power in Europe. East German guards had shot people trying to cross it. Families had been separated by it for decades. And then one night, after a confused announcement by an East German official, thousands of ordinary people simply walked up to the checkpoints and kept walking. The guards, who had received no orders, stood aside. The wall came down in a single night. Gorbachev does not send tanks. Every Soviet leader before him would have. In 1956, Soviet tanks had crushed an uprising in Hungary. In 1968, they had rolled into Czechoslovakia to end a reform movement there. The message had always been the same. Moscow will come. Moscow will always come. But this time, Moscow stays home, and every country that has been living under Soviet influence understands immediately what that silence means. The old rules no longer apply. The signal travels fast. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, three small Baltic states that had been forcibly absorbed into the Soviet Union back in 1940, begin pushing for independence. On August 23, 1989, they do something extraordinary. 2 million people across all three countries walk outside and join hands, forming a human chain 675 kilometers long that stretches from Tallinn in Estonia all the way down through Latvia and into Vilnius in Lithuania. They stand in a line across three countries and say, without a single word of violence, that they do not belong to the Soviet Union, and they never did.
The coup, the referendum, and the final signature.
Then, in August 1991, a group of communist hardliners who are terrified of losing power make a desperate decision. They launch a coup against Gorbachev, announcing on state television that he is ill and no longer in charge. Gorbachev is placed under house arrest at his holiday home in Crimea. For 3 days, it is not clear who is running the country. And then Boris Yeltsin, the elected president of Russia, walks out of the Russian parliament building, climbs onto a tank parked outside, and tells the crowd gathered around him that the coup is illegal and will not stand. Soldiers who had been sent to take over the parliament building refused to fire on the people surrounding it. Within 72 hours, the coup collapses. But the coup has destroyed the very thing it was trying to protect. By trying to hold the Union together by force, the hardliners have convinced every remaining republic that staying is no longer safe. One by one, they vote to leave. On December 1st, 1991, Ukraine holds a referendum on independence. 92% vote yes. Without Ukraine, the second largest republic, the breadbasket of the Soviet world, the Union cannot survive in any meaningful form. On December 25, 1991, at 7:32 in the evening Moscow time, the red Soviet flag is lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. Mikhail Gorbachev sits down, signs his name, and resigns as president of a country that has already ceased to exist. The Soviet Union is exhausted, dissolved, and trying to figure out what 15 new nations are supposed to be when they have never governed themselves. Recovery doesn't take decades. For some of them, it hasn't happened yet. What came after was not freedom. Not exactly. Not for most people. The maps changed overnight. 15 new countries appeared where one had been. Borders that had meant nothing for 70 years suddenly meant everything. People who had gone to sleep as Soviet citizens woke up as Russians, Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Georgians, citizens of countries that were brand new and had no real experience of running themselves. Government offices that had always received their instructions from Moscow now had to figure out how to make their own decisions. Currencies had to be created from nothing. Armies had to be divided up. Nuclear weapons had to be accounted for. And while all of that was happening, the economy collapsed. In Russia, the 1990s became known as the Wild 90s. The name is almost too gentle for what actually occurred. Between 1991 and 1998, Russia's GDP, the total value of everything the country produced, fell by 40%. To put that in perspective, the Great Depression, which devastated the United States and much of the world in the 1930s, saw the American economy shrink by around 30%. Russia's collapse in the 1990s was worse than that, and it happened in peacetime. Life expectancy for Russian men fell from 64 years to 57 years in less than a decade. Not because of a war or a plague, but because of stress, poverty, alcohol, and a health system that was falling apart faster than anyone could hold it together. Hyperinflation arrived and wiped out the savings that ordinary families had spent entire lifetimes building. People who had worked for 30 or 40 years and saved carefully found that their money was suddenly worth almost nothing. Into every gap left by the retreating state, organized crime moved in. Criminal gangs took control of businesses, markets, and neighborhoods. A small number of well-connected men, people who knew how the old Soviet system worked and understood how to exploit the confusion of the new one, acquired entire industries for tiny fractions of their real value. Factories, oil fields, television stations, banks, all of it changed hands in deals that economists would later describe as the largest transfer of wealth through theft in recorded history. These men became known as oligarchs. Meanwhile, the violence that had been held in check by Soviet force began to break through. In Chechnya, a region in southern Russia that declared independence, 2 wars were fought over the course of the 1990s and early 2000s that killed an estimated 100,000 civilians. In Tajikistan, a civil war between rival factions left 50,000 people dead. Across the former Soviet space, 25 million ethnic Russians found themselves suddenly living outside Russia. Minorities in foreign countries they had never expected to be foreign. But ordinary people found ways to survive that no government had planned for and no economist had predicted. They grew food on small garden plots outside the cities. They traded goods and favors with neighbors. They built informal networks of trust in places where official institutions had completely broken down. The resilience was not dramatic or heroic. It was quiet and stubborn and born entirely out of necessity. The Soviet Union rebuilds, but not as the Soviet Union. What rises from its ruins is something stranger, something unfinished, and something the world is still trying to understand. The Soviet Union lasted 69 years. That is not a long time. There are people alive today who were born before it existed and who lived long enough to watch it disappear. A human lifetime. That is all it took for the largest country in history to rise, peak, and collapse into dust. Today, the space it once occupied contains 15 separate countries. Some of them are stable democracies. Some of them are run by governments that look and behave remarkably like the Soviet system they replaced, just with different flags and different names for the same methods of control. 4 of those 15 countries are currently involved in active military conflicts. The borders that were drawn in the chaos of 1991 are still being fought over. And Russia, the largest piece of what remains, still controls the biggest nuclear arsenal on Earth, carrying forward that particular inheritance from the Soviet age, whether it wants to or not. It is tempting, looking back, to tell a simple story about what happened, to say that communism failed and capitalism won, to say that Ronald Reagan's military spending broke the Soviet economy, to say that Gorbachev made a series of political mistakes that a smarter leader would have avoided. All of those things contain pieces of the truth, but none of them is the real answer. The real answer is simpler and harder to sit with. The Soviet Union fell because the people inside it stopped believing in it. Not all at once, not loudly in most cases, but slowly, quietly, over decades of bread queues and sealed coffins and government announcements that contradicted what everyone could see with their own eyes. The belief drained away the way water drains out of a cracked container, gradually, then suddenly, and by the time anyone noticed how little was left, it was already too late. 280 million people eventually stopped pretending, stopped nodding along at the party meetings, stopped repeating the official explanations for things that made no sense, stopped telling their children that the system was working when the evidence all around them said otherwise. And when enough people stop pretending at the same time, even the most powerful government on earth has nothing left to stand on. This is the lesson that sits underneath all the dates and names and specific numbers. Empires do not end when they run out of weapons. They end when they run out of conviction, when the story a system tells about itself no longer matches the lives of the people living inside it closely enough to be believed. Every empire in history has believed at its peak that it was different, that it had found the formula that would make it last. The Soviet Union believed this too. It had the rockets and the warheads and the secret police and the party apparatus and 70 years of practice at keeping people in line. And in the end, none of it was enough. Because you can force people to obey, but you cannot force them to believe. 69 years of ideology, iron, sacrifice, and silence built up across 2 world wars, a space race, a nuclear standoff, and decades of enforced quiet. And it was all gone by Christmas evening, 1991. Not with a bang, not with an invasion or a battle or a dramatic final confrontation. Just a man at a desk, a pen, a signature, and a flag coming down over a building in Moscow while most of the world was busy with the holidays. That is how empires end. Not always in fire, sometimes in paperwork. If this journey through one of history's most dramatic collapses has left you with more questions than answers, good. That means you're paying attention, because this story is only one chapter in a much larger history. The moments that built the modern world, the decisions that changed everything, the people who shaped history in ways that still reach into our lives today. All of it is waiting. If you'd like to keep exploring, hit subscribe and join us for the next journey. Every video is another chapter in the story of how the world we live in came to be. And as always, we'll see you in the past.